So Agile was spun off of the waterfall methodology, and it kind of is the competing model to waterfall. Waterfall is extremely rigid, extremely staged, and you have to work through one thing at a time, and it takes a long time to get complete with it. Agile was created to completely throw that away. They wanted something that could be more quick to get something out to the business, as well as have something that can deal with requirements changes more frequently. And that way you can keep up to speed on them and keep going with the business. We're going to talk about two different Agile methodologies, and the first one is the Scrum model. So this is a kind of a subset of the Agile framework, if you will, and that's what we'll cover right now. So the Scrum model uses an iterative approach, and they call them sprints. So one thing you'll learn with Agile is they have different terminology for the different things they're utilizing. So we'll go over all the terminology. I'll make sure I explain it all to you. So if you're going into a company, or if you work for a company that's using an Agile approach, you get some basics and some background around it. So again, it uses an iterative approach, and they're called sprints. So if you look up here on my model, kind of the image that I have on there, it shows you that you come in on that initial red arrow on the discover, and you work through a design, which is in yellow. You go through in the green and you develop, and then the blue is you test. And that kicks you to the next sprint. And we'll get more into sprints a little bit later on the next slides. A great thing about the Agile methodology and the Scrum model in general is it's very flexible and adaptable, and it's great for dealing with the unknown. One perfect example is Google uses Agile, and they use kind of their own methodology, but their autonomous driving cars, their self-driving cars, is all being built on Agile. This is a leading edge technology. They don't know a whole lot about it. They need to be flexible and adaptable to different requirements and things that come up. And so it helps a lot for them to utilize a Scrum model. Scrum values individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So the waterfall methodology is all about processes and the tools it takes to get there. The Scrum model uses the people and the project team and interacting with them a lot more frequently than the processes and tools. Another thing is the Agile methodology and the Scrum model has a lot less documentation that's being done. And we'll talk about that a lot further as well. But you don't have a big requirements document that comes out when you utilize a Scrum model. You have some base requirements kind of written down. The formality depends on the company that you're working for that utilizes this. Some are very formal and a little bit more detailed. Other companies use very little to no documentation that comes out of it. So it's different, but they really value the interactions. They also value working software over the comprehensive documentation. So we kind of just talked about that. They don't need documentation. They want to get something and get it ready to go. They don't care to sit back and make sure that's all designed and documented 100% prior to engaging. The next thing is they value customer collaboration over contract negotiation. They want the customer to be there. They don't want the customer to say, oh, okay, well, here's the budget and here's what we want to do. They want to say, get in here, Mr. Customer, and let's start working through this, and you can tell us when we're good, right? We can work with you and start collaborating with you and determining how we're going to meet your needs. And another thing is they value responding to change over following a plan. The waterfall methodology and kind of the linear ones are very process-driven, right? You have your step. And Agile, while it has some steps, those could change, they could fluctuate, and they like to be able to respond to change and quickly adjust for that change rather than saying, oh, we can't do that, that's not part of our process, we have to wait till we circle back around or whatever. So Agile and the Scrum model is much more flexible. So the Scrum model, as I kind of mentioned here, is one of many different Agile methods. The other ones include extreme programming, crystal clear, feature-driven, and there's actually another one that I don't have listed that we're going to be covering today, which is the rapid application deployment. So that's what the Scrum model at a very high level looks like. So now let's dive into the Scrum model a little bit more and let's understand it a little bit further. So as you'll see on this slide, I have different things underlined, and those are different terms that you're going to hear throughout utilizing the Scrum model. So very good to have a good understanding of what they are. So the first off, the project team completes sprints. So the project team, a group of people, complete these things they called sprints. It's like their iteration. So the sprint is a short iteration from analysis, development, testing, and possibly deploying a product. So the deploying is obviously, it's going to be after a number of sprints most likely, but the sprints can last anywhere from 14 to 30 days, and that's a set time frame. So whether it's 14 days, that's what your sprints are. Whether it's 30 days, that's what your sprints are. It doesn't fluctuate. Usually a company has a certain sprint that they utilize for all their projects, or a certain sprint that they're going to utilize for this particular project. So within 14 days or up to 30 days, you're working through analysis, development, testing, and you're ready to go with one kind of iterative thing. And as you can see, that's a very short time frame. So what you're doing is you're using a subset of prioritized requirements. Obviously, you can't give them everything they want in 14 to 30 days, or why would the other models even exist? I mean, that's impossible. But what you can do is have a prioritized requirement list and start to work through that. So the prioritized requirement list is called a sprint backlog. And so this is basically the backlog of all those requirements that were chosen for that particular sprint. Is what was decided and committed to that could be completed in that sprint. Another term to know is the product backlog. And this is all the different requirements that people want for this particular product, for this particular software. So this is all the products, or all the enhancements and all the features and everything they want goes in the product backlog. Every sprint, the team gets together, reviews it, plans it. They determine, okay, let's take the top 10, 15 requirements, prioritized requirements, whatever that is, depending on dependencies and length of time to complete. They pull it in, they commit to that for their sprint, and they start running. So we'll get in through that a little bit more. So the project team is made up of the product owner, which is the business side of things, the Scrum development team, and the Scrum master. So the Scrum development team is the business analysts and developers, designers, that whole development side. And the Scrum master is ultimately the facilitator of the sprints. And so we'll go through it and dive into their roles a little bit more. The product owner is responsible for the return on investment. They're ultimately the ones that their head will roll if the product doesn't meet the needs of the business. They're the ones that are bringing the business need forward. They're the ones that are prioritizing those requirements, and they're determining the what. They're ultimately filling that product backlog with all the requirements and needs of the business. And so they're definitely usually a business user that's being brought in, and usually it's a subject matter expert or somebody up in management, senior management, somebody that has a very good grasp on what that business wants and needs out of this particular software. The Scrum Dev team is a cross-functional team, meaning that you're collaborating with business analysts, with designers, with maybe subject matter experts, and all those different pieces as part of it. So it's a cross-functional team that you're utilizing and you're collaborating with. And they're the ones that are really determining the how and then making sure that they're able to execute that how and code for that. The Scrum Master is the team facilitator. They don't have any power. They're just there to facilitate, make sure that they're clearing roadblocks, setting time frames and expectations, and they're communicating and providing that visibility of that project and the status of that project and those sprints to executive management or whomever the sponsor is of the particular project. So let's talk a little bit about what they call artifacts. So artifacts are kind of their term for some of the different pieces within the Scrum model and actually Agile in general. The first thing is the product backlog, and we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but this is a list of features that the business wants, and it's force ranked by the product owner. So when I say force ranked, I mean there can only be one number one, there can only be one number two, there can only be one number three. And trust me, that sounds easier than It's easier said than done to get somebody to force rank them. So if you have a product owner that's able to go through and actually force rank requirements, that's a huge bonus on your project, and that's a huge help. But you need to make sure that they are force ranking them, because you can't have 10 number one requirements, because what happens if you can only complete 7 of them in the sprint? You have no way to know what 7 are more important than the other 3. Another thing about the product backlog is anyone can add items. So users may be adding items to the product backlog. Subject matter experts could be adding items. People, I guess, from the Scrum development team I've seen add items to the product backlog if they've seen something and kind of understand a business need and how that can be accomplished. And it could be user stories or use cases that are utilized as to how to, as to basically what that product backlog is. It could be a user story or a use case that's documented. If you don't know much about that, you can do some research. Otherwise, I do have some other lectures that cover user stories and use cases. The product backlog does not contain tasks. It is simply a list of requirements. It's not of what tasks need to be completed. It's not a task list. It is what requirements need to be completed to meet that business need. So now let's look at the sprint backlog. So the sprint backlog is a subset of the product backlog. This is the committed features that will be completed during that current sprint, that 14 to 30 days. So they take requirements from the product backlog, usually based on whatever the highest priorities are, but they may snag some lower priority ones if they're going to be easy to accomplish, and they can squeeze them into that sprint, and they commit to them and say, this is our sprint backlog, this is what we're going to get done in our 14 to 30 days. They have a deadline to complete it, obviously at the end of that sprint. Where the product backlog, there's no deadline, it's just an ongoing list. And there may be features that are put in there, and quite frankly, there will be, that'll never be realized. They'll just keep dropping to the bottom of the list, and they'll never be put in because they're not, it's a good idea maybe, but it's not really very useful, or the return isn't very high, and so they get lower priority. Also with the sprint backlog is, since you have a deadline, you need to track where you're at on all those different requirements. You need to track what wasn't started and what's in progress and what's completed. So you're working through and identifying where are those different committed requirements at, where is that sprint backlog requirements list at, and what does that look like, and what stage are they in. So we're going to continue on with the Scrum model and talk about the meetings that take place as part of the Scrum model process. The first meeting that always happens is the sprint planning meeting. And this is where the product team gets together and the project team gets together, and they're committing to items in that sprint backlog. So they're taking a look at that product backlog and they're saying, okay, knowing our length of the sprint, knowing the dependencies of the different items on the product backlog, understanding their priority, what items can we complete in this sprint? And it's very important that they get this right. And really, the longer the project team works together, project over project, you try to keep the same team together, the more accurate they'll become on what they can complete in those different sprints. Once they've committed to that and they're working through, they also have a daily Scrum meeting. So this is a daily 15-minute meeting. Generally, it's called a stand-up meeting. And that really means that you're not sitting around a table. You're getting together in a room and you're collaborating. You don't want it to go over 15 minutes, otherwise you're wasting time. And what you do is you go one by one around all the different individuals as part of the project team, and you talk about what did you complete yesterday, what's on your plan to complete today, and what roadblocks or issues are you running into. And that way you're basically understanding what every single person is working on, and that Scrum Master is getting a good feel as to, okay, are we moving forward? If they hear that people are working on things that are maybe away from what they're expecting, they can call that out and talk about it and collaborate with it. As well as if there's roadblocks or issues that's being ran into, that Scrum Master is in charge of making sure that those roadblocks are removed and the team is able to continue forward without running into any major snags as part of the project. Another meeting that happens is this is kind of So we started with the sprint planning meeting that happens at the beginning of the sprint. Your daily scrum, that's obviously happening every day. So that's a repeatable thing for depending on how many days your sprint is. Once that sprint is done, you do a sprint review. So you're demonstrating that product. You're getting feedback from the business, from users, from the product owner. And so you have something tangible you're showing. You maybe even letting them click around with it and play with it a little bit. You're getting some good feedback. And then you have what you call the sprint retrospective. And this is where you're inspecting that sprint that just got done. And you're saying, okay, what went well? What didn't go well? What did we run into? What problems did we run into that we need to account for in future sprints? Maybe we took on too much in that sprint. Maybe we took on too little. Maybe we skimped on the testing and ran into a lot of issues during our demonstration. Whatever that is, whatever those lessons learned are, you're working through it in that sprint retrospective to try to help avoid that in future sprints. And there's a fifth step, and this is kind of a step that if you go look it up, this isn't a common step you'll see, but this is one that I've seen utilized very well in Scrum model and Agile teams, and that's the product backlog refinement. So this is where before you start that next sprint, go take a look at that product backlog. Go look at everything that's in there, because again, you could have users throwing stuff in there. You don't really know the quality of what's getting put in there, but you want to go through and adjust those items. Clarify some of them. Maybe you want to take one that was put in there and split it up into multiple items because the idea or the requirement, the concept that they put in there is just really large, and it would be very difficult to handle that in one sprint. So you break that up into different pieces that you can handle and kind of work through that way. And also you're looking at all the different dependencies. So there may be requirements that, okay, for us to do this requirement, we have to have this requirement also done. They tie in together, and one can't be done without the other. Or this one can't be done until at least after this other requirements has been met. So you're determining those dependencies and making sure that you've got a good idea of that. So as you're getting ready and you commit to items in your next sprint planning meeting, you're kind of set up for success. So those are the key meetings as part of the Scrum model. So what are the pros and the cons to the Scrum model, right? We've talked about a lot of pieces, but when is the right time, and what are the good and the bad of it? Well, the first good is it's flexible and adaptable to changing requirements. So as you can notice, you have the product backlog. The only requirements that have to really be defined and committed to are the ones that go into that sprint backlog that you're working through as part of the sprint. All those other requirements, it doesn't matter. They can change, they can fluctuate. Half the requirements could be deleted and rewritten, and it doesn't affect anything in that particular project. Also, it gets work out in front of the business. So they get a tangible product, something they can see and demonstrate and possibly utilize really early. 14 to 30 days is nothing. I mean, that's really quick. And granted that first iteration, 2, 3 aren't going to be grand. I mean, it's going to be basic stuff, basic architecture and things set up, but at least they get to see something and they can help guide and understand where that's going. The next thing is it promotes collaboration between the business and development teams. So if you remember from the waterfall model, one of the cons to that is you can sometimes create a rift or a wall between the business and between the development teams. Well, the Scrum model really evaporates that wall. You can't really have that because you have to work closely together. That product owner's working with the Scrum dev team, is working with the Scrum master. They're all on one team. Everybody's helping everybody else out. There's not one person that's in charge of testing and one person that's gathering the requirements. Everybody's working together to put their heads together and make sure that the requirements and the product and the testing and everything is perfect, and they're all kind of chipping in with another. So it really helps to collaborate between the teams. As well as you're getting daily feedback on what's going on. So you're not having people stuck spinning their wheels, whether that's in requirement definition, whether that's in development or testing. You're seeing those roadblocks. Some people, as part of a project team and not in the agile methodology, they'll sit and spin their wheels for a while before they, maybe a couple days before they bring it up and say, okay, I'm having an issue, right? They try to do their due diligence to solve it, which is great. But in a tight timeline project, that can cost you to have to move out the schedule of the project and cause the project to no longer be considered a full success because the schedule had to move. Well, this is forcing that in that daily stand-up meeting. You're working through, and basically every person is getting called out on what they worked on the day before, what their plan is for that day, and any roadblocks they're running into. So it helps stop the spinning wheels. Well, it sounds great, right? What are the common cons to this particular model? Why do some companies maybe not use it? Well, one of the key things is there's no defined end date, right? I mean, you're working through this Scrum model and you're working through these sprints over and over and over and over, but there's not a good time just to say, okay, we're good, right? We're good enough. This product's good. You're always going to have business needs and requirements that are going to be out there. They're just going to have a less and less and less impact and return on investment. So it's hard to really define when that final end date is and to stop the scope creep from happening in the scope of the project continually blowing up and ballooning. As well as it relies on the commitment of all team members. So since you're working together and you're having daily meetings and you're working through that, these team members need to be pretty committed to this particular project. Most of the time, that project team is only working on that particular product. And maybe they're working on one other one, but generally mixing multiple together can cause issues. So they're working in one, they need to be committed, and that includes the business owners as well. And just getting that level of commitment is tough for a lot of different businesses to do. The next thing is it's challenging to adopt and train all the people in Scrum. So as I'm kind of telling you here, it's taking 2 different lectures for me to give you the basics of how Scrum works. We're not even diving in to actually do it. I'm just giving you the understanding of the different terminology in the meetings and how it works. Well, to actually do it, it takes a lot of experience and training to do that. You also have to train a Scrum Master, so it can be challenging and costly to get that set up. Another reason is if there's any type of turnover in that project team, whether turnover for promotions, moving to a different project team, or they're leaving the company, going to a different role, anything like that, that can have a huge, drastically negative effect on that project. So those team members are so innerly woven, it's hard to be able to snag another new person and pull them in and get them engaged in everything that's going on and get them to understand what's happened up to that point to lead the decisions and discussions. So it's very hard if you have a team member leaving, especially if it's a critical team member that has a lot of knowledge of this particular product that you're building. So when should you use the Scrum model? When is it good to use? Some of these will be kind of obvious based on the pros and the cons, but when the project's unpredictable and it's going to have changing requirements, the Scrum model or the Agile model in general is very good to utilize. It's also good when using or creating leading edge technology. And I mentioned that earlier when we were talking about Google. Google uses the Agile methodology and the Scrum model because they're constantly evolving and they're going into areas that nobody's gone before. And so without having anybody there in that kind of technology area, there's going to be lots of learnings. The requirements are going to change very quickly based on the new knowledge and stuff that you're learning through each one. So they're working through the sprints, learning from it, talking about it, lessons learned, moving into that next sprint with that knowledge and ready to go again. The next thing is if your organization has an experienced Scrum Master, that helps a lot. The Scrum Masters are really a key and integral part. There's actually certifications strictly for becoming a Scrum Master. So it's an integral part of the team, and somebody that's experienced is very helpful. So if you have somebody in the organization, obviously it's a lot easier to utilize the Scrum model if you have a Scrum Master already there. Another one is the business has a good resource to utilize and they have time to dedicate to the project. So we kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. That product owner has a lot of control for the business. If they're misrepresenting the business needs, if they're not able to dedicate enough time, that project is going to likely fail because the sprints aren't going to be driven very well. They're going to be pulling requirements out of the product backlog into the sprint backlog, and they may not be prioritized correctly. The requirements could be wrong, and they're not going to meet the business need. So it's important to have a good business user that's going to be engaged and dedicated, or at least nearly dedicated to the product. The next thing is you can use this when you have pressure to quickly get something tangible. If there is urgent need to have something tangible and something working out there, this is a great model for it. Once you get that project set up, in that first 14 to 30 days, you're going to have something at least demoable to show them kind of where you're going with it. So it's nice to be able to kind of work through that quickly. Another piece is if you don't have much concern for the length of the project or the budget, this is a great one to utilize. Some of the best ways I've seen this utilized is for internal systems with a business where this is their main system they use. So maybe this is a particular software that they've created a custom software for their business, and they just have a team that's continually evolving and supporting that. And there's always business needs and changes that are needed to that product. And so they just dedicate a project team to simply support that particular application, and that application is continually enhanced and changed to meet those ever-changing business needs. So when you don't really care about the budget and you can afford that, or it makes sense, and you have that project team available, perfect. Last is the development team has to be engaged throughout the project. So in the waterfall methodology and some of the iterative methodologies, the development team is engaging, doing the development, and then they're able to back off and work on other projects or other products. Well, in the agile methodology and the Scrum model, they can't really back off. They're engaged as part of that project team, and they're constantly developing, right? I mean, they're constantly designing and developing the pieces because they're developing and designing smaller increments, much smaller increments to work through, and then they're helping with the testing as well. So this works really well when the development team doesn't have resource constraints, when they have an ample number of developers to be able to dedicate to the project and have it worked through. So that's the Scrum model. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Again, we've only touched the surface of Agile and the Scrum model, but this will give you the basics that you need to work through an interview or to start at a company as a business analyst within the Agile world.